Welcome. I'm Delia Clark, and I'm a place-based education consultant working with the Iditarod Historic Trail Alliance in partnership with the Chugach National Forest, the BLM Campbell Creek Science Center, and the Anchorage Park Foundation. In normal years, we offer the Iditarod Trail to Every Classroom program, which we call ITREC, as an 11-day in-person teacher professional learning program spread across a year. ITREC encourages teachers to think about how they can connect to place, how they can bring their students outside more, how they can bring resources into the classroom, and how they can connect with the Iditarod Trail and the cultural and natural landscapes of Alaska. During the pandemic, we're offering some of the core elements of iTrek as a webinar series to continue to serve Alaskan educators in ways that we hope are valuable to you. We hope that you're able to use the information you get today to encourage your students to get outside and learn more about the nature and culture of Alaska. We'll be offering this series throughout the school year, and we hope you're able to attend more sessions. If you're interested in receiving one UAA credit for participating in this series, if you register right away, you might still be able to get in under the wire. It's just about, I think we're just past the deadline, but you might still be able to get in. Or if you'd like a flyer listing the full series, please contact us at itrecalaska@gmail.com. So it's itrecalaska@gmail.com. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Kevin Keeler. Kevin works with the Bureau of Land Management, and he is the administrator of the Iditarod National Historic Trail. So over to you, Kevin.
Great, thanks, Delia. And this is pretty exciting to be here because it feels like it really kicks off the preparation for the Iditarod season, where we've made it past winter solstice and spring is coming and activity is starting to happen on the trail with a bunch of events that are going to be occurring out on the trail in the future in the next month or so. And but in the meanwhile, I'm going to talk to you tonight about the past century of the trail, especially the part of the trail, the history of the trail that made it significant and why it was ultimately designated as a National Historic Trail. National trails, just to provide some background on this, there's 30 national scenic and historic trails around the country. These include trails like the Appalachian Trail, Pony Express Trail, the Lewis and Clark Trail. For folks who are teachers out there, I wager that you can find pretty much you can take any trail that's out there and build a lesson plan around it. There is so much diversity in the national trail system around the country, so many lessons to be learned today, so many things that can be potentially taught. This is a map of the national trail system around the country that covers many of the states of the country. So there's a good chance if you're not here in Alaska, you're probably pretty close to a national scenic or historic trail. So the Iditarod National Historic Trail is Alaska's only national historic trail, there's no national scenic trails in Alaska. It's, as I dug into it, looking at it, America's last great gold rush trail. Basically, it is pretty much the last trail of a whole string of gold rushes that bounced around the countryside. I think that first started actually in Georgia with a gold rush. And then the big one that everybody knows about is California Gold Rush in 1849. And Manifest Destiny and gold rushes continued throughout the country for the next half century plus, and pretty much culminated with the Iditarod Gold Rush. And we'll talk about that more. One of the unique things about the Iditarod in the National Trail System is it's the only winter trail in the National Trail System. When you get into other national trails, like the Pony Express, well, they weren't out there on the ground with the Pony Express Trail in the winter time. Generally, pretty much trails within the lower 48 revolve around summertime use. Well, that's different here. The Iditarod, unlike many of the trails like the Pony Express that relied heavily on either livestock to get around on the trail, the Iditarod is dedicated really to man's best friend, and was made possible by man's best friend, you might say. So if you're a dog lover, the Iditarod Trail is a good place to be. So anyway, we're going to mush on from here. And I don't know if anybody has any knowledge as to what the term mush means or where it came from. As I look back into it a bit, it appears that it may have come from the French term marche or walk. And back in the day, historically, people would talk about either mushing dogs or just mushing. So it was a slang term about 100 years ago or so, where people were talking about walking dogs or walking themselves cross country. And there was a lot of cross country walking that occurred back in those days. So the historic trail really didn't exist. And I'm just going to shrink my back before the 20th century. But there was a number of different native people's trails of use that were guided by geography. Pretty much our geography in Alaska dictates where the best routes are and the best locations for things to happen. A good location for a trail, a good location for a camp, a good location for a lot of these features. 100 years ago, 400 years ago, 50 years ago is still a good location today, unless the land use has been dramatically changed. And so there is a number of areas of different Alaska native use and settlement that occurred before the Iditarod became a trail that was recognized by the white man. And this is reflected in these different groups of native folks who lived around the country, this part of the world. Living in Alaska before the white man came was a very challenging life. People migrated seasonally to the resources that would allow them to survive. Areas such as the Upper Kuskokwim, which is the area that was, in a sense, bridged by the Iditarod Trail, had surprisingly low populations over vast regions. Something like maybe 1,000 people in an area that would be literally hundreds of millions of acres. When you understand that there is this lack of resource and the harshness of the seasons, you can understand that life would not sustain more than a small number of inhabitants. And people grouped together in bands, family bands basically, in settlements that were seasonal and moved around based on the resources and the suitability of shelter. So people would have a summer camp, they would have a winter camp, they would travel between the two and pursue their different resource gathering activities that would go on at that time. Because there was such a lack of resources, people only kept a few dogs in those days. A well-off person might have 2 or 3 dogs and would use them as pack animals. It was really later, after the white man came into the country, that it was possible to keep larger numbers of dogs, and I'll mention that in a moment. In the late 1700s, Russia began colonizing Alaska for its furs and established a 3,000-mile supply chain that stretched back to Moscow and St. Petersburg. It would take years for the Russians who were involved with the colonization that occurred to get back to Mother Russia, if they made it at all. It was extremely dangerous. Their water crossings across the Bering Sea were just miserable and would frequently shipwreck the people involved. You can read their first-person description of their exploits in a journal by Lieutenant Laverty Zagoskin. The Russian expeditions, like the Americans to come, focused on coastal areas and traveling up the major river systems. Up the Yukon River, which I'm kind of highlighting here, and the Kuskokwim River. This was the areas that were traveled into, and also the coastal areas up in Upper Cook Inlet that the Russians established ports, or I should say forts, and ran their fur gathering programs out of. And with that, they began naming and renaming for their linguistic system from the native people's names of various places, which I have labeled here with both Russian place names and contemporary place names. And some do, to a certain extent, survive today or in a similar fashion, such as Unalaklik, which is now Unalakleet, up on Norton Sound. Much of the technology that was ultimately developed and used on the Iditarod Trail and around Alaska in the opening of the country by the Russians and then America were initially perfected by native people and then modified for new purposes. There's an amazing heritage of working with leather and weaving and woodworking that ultimately became, for instance, in this picture, you've got some fish nets over here that are being placed under the ice and into sled dog construction. The Russians introduced new technology in the use of dog teams. In particular, they, because were able to gather a surplus of food, were able to use sleds pulled by dog teams and introduce the concept of a lead dog and the use of a single line to pull teams. And you'll see that's different than other styles that are around the world. If you look at, for instance, the dog sledding that happens in Greenland, the traditional dog sledding, you have multiple tug lines that go out basically from the sled to each of the dogs themselves. This is because they're traveling across open country, treeless country, and there wasn't an issue with basically getting wrapped around a tree as compared to the Alaskan countryside or Siberia, where these traditions came from. So the Russians brought us some new technology that was later adapted. So in 1867, the United States, William Seward bought, had convinced Abraham Lincoln and then the following president, whose name I should know, but I don't, to purchase Alaska for one of the bargain basement deals ever. I would imagine Russia wished they had it back. When the Russians withdrew, things became pretty quiet in Alaska for the first decade or so after the purchase by the United States. Most of the population was centered in Southeast Alaska, and there was not a lot of knowledge about what the countryside held in terms of resources or represented at all. There were American explorers who traveled the river systems on immense multi-year journeys and met the people who had been living there for thousands of years and reported back. If you want to learn more about those, you can look those various expeditions up and read some pretty interesting stories about these multiple year expeditions across the country, side of Alaska. Another way that America interfaced with the native peoples were through the U.S. revenue cutters, which is a predecessor for the U.S. Coast Guard. This is a great picture that I really enjoy. It's a picture from basically folks dancing on the revenue cutter, the Bear, in the Bering Sea. And just represents how welcoming people were to these foreigners who were coming onto their landscape. The main value for Alaska at that time was still seen as an outpost from which to extract fur. And remembering, we're talking now in the late 1860s, early 1870s, America was still in the throes of manifest destiny, basically conquering the continent, putting transcontinental railroads and telegraphs across the countryside, selling off vast acreage of lands for agricultural purposes, passing laws like the mining law of 1872 that really opened the doors for private individuals to go out and basically attempt to do establish mining claims and that sort of thing. And this resulted in a number of gold finds around the country. And the first one that kicked off in this part of the world was actually not in Alaska, but it was in the Klondike, in the Yukon territories, but up and over the mountains from Skagway. This is a great newspaper headline, pretty straightforward: gold, 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 gold. 68 rich men on the steamer Portland, stacks of yellow metal. It's interesting to read about, you know, if you had $5,000 in your pocket, you're considered to be a very rich person back in those days. So basically this popped the cork on the value to America of the North Country, and Seward's folly was no longer considered to be a folly. All the obvious commercial interests jumped in. Again, iron steamships left Portland every 5 days for Skagway, and the gold rush and the whole concept of the gold rush was an amazing I guess, center of interest for the popular culture back in those days. You've got games for children being developed, you've got music, and later on, a number of movies were done, which were pretty interesting about that. But the experience on the ground may not have been as swell as the popular media imagined. There were plenty of travails awaiting the gold seekers who were out there. Here's the stampeders in consultation on the White Pass Trail. So basically what happened in the story of the opening of Alaska and the establishment of the Iditarod Trail was that people worked in from the edges, and they used the most likely travel routes earlier in this form, basically water, both liquid and frozen, to get over around the vast distances. On this map, we don't have the White Pass and the route up to Skagway, or I'm sorry, from Skagway up to Dawson. But there was a number of other early gold rushes that were going on. A gold rush in Upper Cook Inlet, from Susitna Station up into the Hatcher Pass area. Later on, in the late 1890s, Nome was occurring. Fairbanks happened in 1903. So people slowly but surely worked their way in and were prospecting all along the way before 1908. I mentioned here in South Central Alaska, there were paying prospects in the Talkeetna Mountains and the Upper Susitna, and they led to the founding of some of the first communities in this part of the world, with Knik and Susitna Station, also Hope and Girdwood, and later on Seward itself. People would use these locations as places to offload freight and get as close as they possibly could before beginning their journeys to the mountains and the hills that had potential prospects for gold. I mentioned Girdwood. Colonel Girdwood staked claims in Upper Crow Creek, and which led to the founding of, which is now named Girdwood after this person who is not a colonel, but people like to name themselves or reinvent themselves when they came to Alaska. And if you're considered to be a colonel, it showed that you had status from a variety of different sources. But like I mentioned, they might have been a little fast and loose with their reinventions. So it's kind of interesting that we have a town up here named Girdwood for a guy who was never really a colonel. Anyway, Crow Pass and Eagle River were crossed by Walter Mendenhall, a person who now has his name attached to the Mendenhall Glacier down in Juneau. And he was a geologist to the U.S. Army expedition and did the first mapping of the route itself. So little by little, people were putting together this jigsaw puzzle, and it was a very big jigsaw puzzle. You could see with a lot of blank spots on the map that continue to be blank spots for a number of years. Then in 1899, a place that had not been at all in existence popped into existence overnight. Gold was discovered in Nome, and people went wild with that. And it was a good thing too, because pretty much the gold had played out in Dawson and the Klondike. This photo here shows 391 on the list for Cape Nome, September 22nd of 1899. So that looks like quite the wait list there. And it's a good thing to remember if we're ever stuck in an airport. So there's a great description. It's one of my favorite quotes from Alfred Brooks, who the Brooks Range is named for, and he's the head of the USGS survey, describing riding down the river from Eagle. And so what happened was all the folks who weren't making it in Eagle or in Dawson City, in the Klondike, basically heard about this new gold rush and they headed west for the next one. So he wrote, "I boarded the first downriver boat with difficulty, for it was already crowded with passengers from Dawson. It had received the culls from the Klondike who would not venture until the future of the new El Dorado was assured. The majority of my fellow passengers were those who formed the parasites in a new gold camp. Gamblers, thieves, thugs, and women of the lower world crowded the steamer to its capacity." And this is the best line. "My sleep under a table in the dining room was broken by the noise of a gambling game going on over my head." So things are pretty rough and tumble in those days. If you wanted to get a boat to Nome, you might have to sleep under a bunch of people who are gambling in the table above you. Nome Rush was very different than the Klondike Rush because there is no terrain like the White Pass or the Mounties at the top of the pass to weed out persons who weren't strong enough to make it. When you went up and over the White Pass, you had to be carrying $1,000 US and a certain amount of pounds of provisions and that sort of thing. And if not, the Mounties would turn you back. It was very different in Nome. Basically, you could just jump on a steamer in Seattle, and provided it didn't sink on the way there or you got stranded, you'd be deposited on the treeless tundra a few weeks later. So Nome was very different. It really didn't weed folks out quite as much as the other rush did. And Nome brought us this concept of going outside because Nome was locked in ice for 6 months of the year. Things were colder back in those days. Here's a photo from June 2nd, 1907, it appears, 4 miles from shore. This is the closest they could get to shore with a steamboat to unload materials. And so this whole concept of going outside came into prominence, and it's still a term we use here today in Alaska. For instance, I'm kind of swooping over with the cursor. The outside mail arrived at the Nome post office. And Nome was the second or third largest town in Alaska after Juneau and Fairbanks, depending on which year we're talking about. Nome brought all the big city ways of living that you could find in the late 19th century in America. Although things are still, could be challenging, things that we take for granted today, like snow removal. Back in those days, there was no such thing as heavy equipment. So it was pretty hard to move snow loads, and it just ended up in the middle of the streets during that time. You had electric lights, you had indoor entertainment, such as this packed Eagle Theater, and reading and even waiting for the mail was a big deal because mail from the outside was cherished. It brought news of the world and entertainment during the long winter time. And Nome invented some of the outdoor entertainment that we're going to be talking about right here. Sled dog racing, long distance sled dog racing started up in Nome because people have been using dog teams for utility purposes to reach the mines outside of town and move freight back and forth, people back and forth. And then because people had time on their hands in the wintertime, they realized, oh, we should try some racing with these dog teams. And so this is where the first long distance race in Alaska began, the All Alaska Sweepstakes. It was 400 miles out and back, and became a real popular event within Nome itself. At this time, basically rules for dog care were instituted in Nome. Different dog teams were treated like NFL teams of today. They were given special colors and heraldry. Rules from, for instance, horseback racing, prevention of animal cruelty were instituted, and dog mushing really took off. And of course, there was some incentive because people had a little bit of gold dust or some gold nuggets in their pockets. And you might say there'd be a couple wagers here and there, back and forth between people on the different teams that were out there on the trail. And interestingly, these teams would follow telegraph systems that would go out to these far-flung settlements that were the various different gold camps. So they could actually follow real time the progress of these dog teams to the checkpoints, through the checkpoints, just like they are followed today. So it's pretty fun to see and follow the Iditarod sled dog race and realize that following the teams through the checkpoints is pretty much the same and hasn't really changed at all as it was occurring 100 plus years ago. Dog mushing was a talk of town. Everybody was paying attention to that big board that I mentioned. Here we've got a whole bunch of different little vignettes that, for instance, show a woman asking for bread, and she says, "No change, lady, we can't bake and keep posted on the dog race at the same time." So dog racing just became the biggest thing that you can imagine in Nome itself. And it created four-legged and two-legged celebrities like Baldy on the left and Leonard Seppala on the right, who won 4 of the sweepstakes races. And also Togo, who led his team, was a major celebrity up there too. Maybe they weren't having as much fun back in South Central Alaska as they were up in Nome. People were pushing up through the Kenai Peninsula. A railroad was established in Seward and was pushed north into the Kenai Peninsula. Little did they realize they were pushing into one of the biggest snow fields in Alaska. And basically there's 2 different private railroad interests that one got 13 miles out of Seward and then went bankrupt. Another one took it over and they got up to Turnagain Arm, and then they went bankrupt at Kern Creek. But there was a push to get a railroad up into the interior to serve these gold interests. In 1905, contract mail began via dog sled from Seward to Susitna Station over Crow Pass and via Crow Creek. And then through Knik. Here's a photo down in Seward of a team that's about to head out. And one of the things I want to say right just on the side here too is that what's really fascinating about all of the history involved with this is that so much of it is so accessible. I mean, photography had been happening already for like 50 or 60 years. People were carrying cameras around and taking pictures. A lot of this is very accessible, and you can find this information today on the State of Alaska State Archives, where there's been a move to try to centralize a whole bunch of different photography. And you can go to this Sled Vilda site, it's called, and just type in the keywords Iditarod, and you will be looking at pictures for hours if you're that sort of person, because there are so many pictures. Anyway, in 1908, a new route was established over Indian Pass, which is the next major drainage west of Crow Pass. It was less avalanchy, even though there are some avalanches in this picture here. And so there was competition back and forth. Anyway, because there was all this gold mining going on in the Seward Peninsula in Northwest Alaska, and there was a whole bunch happening down in South Central Alaska, the Alaska Road Commission recognized the need and the possibility of establishing an overland route between the two areas. And so they sent a colonel, who was truly a colonel in this case, Walter Goodwin, to do an expedition between January 31st and April 5th of 1908. So he went on his expedition basically by dog team and assessed the route between Nome and Seward. This is a picture of the team with a measuring wheel attached to their sled so they can measure the mileages between the towns and the roadhouses and the other geographic features. And this is what his report, which theoretically burnt up in a fire at the National Archives a number of years ago, would be one of the holy grails for the Iditarod Trail. It's never been located. Theoretically, as I mentioned, it was burnt up, but we don't know that for sure. And like I mentioned about the photography, there is still a lot that's really unknown about the historic Iditarod Trail. There's still stuff out there waiting to be discovered, and which really makes it very fascinating to get into the stories on the trail. Anyway, while Goodwin was out there on the trail, the private concerns were out there too. Miners and mushers were exploring different routes from around the countryside, and they were basically booming for and pushing for the establishment of different routes. There was a lot of boosterism that went on by the different communities, Seward especially, really wanted to boost itself into the position of being San Francisco of the North. And you can still see it today in some of the people who live there. And maybe you guys will have a chance to meet Dan Seavey. He's always pushing for Seward to become an even bigger place than it is. So anyway, the media in the different towns would provide different reports about people, how they use the trail, what it took to use the trail. Here we've got a Mr. Powell coming in from the Anoco country in 28 days of actual traveling. And that's where the majority of the use was. It was between these gold fields that were up around McGrath, which I hadn't mentioned at the moment, really not the whole long distance itself. Well, Walter Goodwin had a little bit different conclusion. He really felt like there wasn't enough use to justify opening up this long trail because there was a lack of demand. There really wasn't much happening in the upper Kuskokwim country around McGrath. There are a few small mines and whatnot, but it wasn't enough again to establish a new route. But on Christmas Day of 1908, there was a gold discovery in a place called Discovery Creek, which ultimately became the Iditarod goldfields that made all the difference. This is how people used to prospect in that part of the country back in the days, and which is pretty darn fascinating in itself. Basically, these miners that were called drift miners would set up a camp for the winter at locations that they think might have potential. They would light a fire, they would melt the ice in the ground, they dig a hole until they hit ice again or frozen ground. They light another fire, and you can see the stacks of firewood right here. And then they would keep doing that and doing that until they hit bedrock. And where the two miners who discovered gold in the area, Beaton and Dykeman, were in a place that was ultimately called Flat, which was also Discovery. Bedrock was only 30 feet below the surface. So there's 30 feet of alluvial material on top of that. And then the placer gold would lay in the quartzite veins and accumulate in the riffles right in that intersection between these placer deposits, which got removed, and the bedrock itself. So these guys discovered gold in December of 1908, and pay attention to that date because that's important. So the thing about the Iditarod goldfields, they were 1,000 miles from nowhere, literally. It took, basically, it would be 1,000 miles by water to get from just tidewater over to the gold fields themselves. Ultimately, 500 miles overland from the Seward area, a real whopping long distance from Fairbanks, and they were really far out in the middle of nowhere. They were so far out that it basically took them about a half a year to get out of the country, and they kept the word hush hush. but then somebody spilled the beans, and then fall of 1909, there was a rush to Iditarod. But the miners basically got frozen in on the Yukon River and didn't make it in 1909, and they stayed there for the winter time. So it really wasn't until 1910 that people made it to the Iditarod gold fields. Here's a photo of Chichakos landing in Iditarod, July 26, 1910. And the New York Times reported 10,000 gold seekers arrive, and the confusion is great. And again, mentioning the whole thing about the accessibility of the historic resources, basically, if you have a New York Times account, you can go into the New York Times and look up information about the gold rush to the Iditarod, which is pretty darn fascinating itself. I love looking at these old photos and to pick out the details that are in them. Like you've got this gentleman standing here with his bowler cap, and it looks like his suit on. People wore their best clothes pretty much everywhere, and that may have been all that they had. Anyway, the town of Iditarod was selected because it was the closest place you could get a paddle wheeler to the location of the gold strike, which became named Flat. And it quickly went from becoming a tent town to a warehouse town. It's really in some ways not much different than Anchorage today. In those days, people were warehousing materials that were going to the gold fields. Nowadays, we warehouse materials in Anchorage that's getting shipped by FedEx or UPS between continents. Anyway, it's a good thing they brought a lot of building materials because it's a really barren place out there. It's just small stunted timber. Freeze up starts in October and lasts until May. It's windswept, boggy hills that have little vegetation. It's permafrost underneath. And when it isn't freezing, there's mosquitoes everywhere. This is a picture from September 1910 that shows the frenzy of work happening, trying to get all the structures buttoned up before winter comes. And these old photos show the massive quantities of wood that were used to heat these buildings. And these buildings really had little more insulation than old clothing, rags, newspaper, or moss from insulation. And this is cold, cold country out here. This country is a big basin where the cold just settles in, and I'm sure they had weeks on end of 50 and 60 below. Summertime was pretty darn busy. Here's Iditarod, Alaska, 1911, and 3 steamboats sitting there ready to go, with one of them heading out to Fairbanks pretty soon. So everything was brought in. And here we have another photo. Maybe it's the same guy with the bowler hat. I don't know. It looks a little dirty, worse for the wear. And you can see they're looking out toward the river here with 2 steamboat pilot houses in the distance. Solid ground was not to be found in this town. The entire place was covered with permafrost. And so if you ran any wheeled vehicles or horses around, it was just churned up and turned into mud. There are stories of horses literally drowning in the mud there because it was so bad. Sawdust and building scraps were thrown into the mud holes, just anything that they could find to make the lanes passable in the town of Iditarod. You may have also noticed the wide streets in these photos. By this time, people have been moving around from town to town and started to realize what it would take actually to survive in these different towns. And one of the biggest threats in that time was fire. Number of these towns burnt down, and so the streets were laid out, the towns were platted, so the roads were really wide here. Unfortunately, it still didn't always work out really well. Here you've got a photo from April 4th, 1911, which is interesting that it's only basically about 8 months or 10 months after the settlement of the town originally. And the town is on fire because people are burning massive quantities of wood to keep warm and trying to keep warm. So what was really interesting, and back to these old photos, the thing that saved them were wet blankets. They basically soaked down, and I don't know where they came up with enough water, except this is April, so they had probably a bit more water than they even wanted at that time. They soaked down these blankets and hung them over the buildings to prevent embers from being thrown and basically setting the other side of the block on fire. Everybody endured this because they were after the gold. Everybody was out there to make their fortune, either off the gold itself or from the miners. Here's a picture of Flat, Alaska. And these two towns were considered to be some of the biggest in Alaska at the time, with a population of at least 10,000 combined between the two, possibly even more than that. It's pretty difficult to get an accurate reading on this. Sled dog racing was a big deal again. Here's the 3rd annual Kennel Club race in Iditarod in 1914, a 22-mile race that brought a whole bunch of people together. And proved also something we've known all along, that Alaskan women are really tough. Here's the 1914 ladies dog sled race in Iditarod itself. Back to our much through history. So now there is a reason to build a trail that Goodwin had previously thought was not justifiable. So just like now, people lobbied for government improvements. Here's a telegraph from the governor of Alaska, from the Arctic Club to the governor of Alaska, asking for weekly mail service to Iditarod due to the lack of telegraphic communication and similar transportation issues. So with this gold rush, hundreds of people set out annually, either coming or going to and from the Iditarod Gold District. And actually most of them set out by foot. Some set out by dogs team. They were probably better, had more money and more resources. But a number of people used single person Yukon style sleds, maybe pulled by one dog or maybe just by a person themselves, such as in this picture. Or then there's also the traditional larger freight sleds, like over to the left in the rear here, with these mushers lined up down in the main street of Seward. So anyway, back in 1911, the Alaska Road Commission decided, well, okay, we'll put a route over to the Iditarod gold fields and let's go through Crow Pass. So they sent Colonel Goodwin back through and they reestablished the trail, this time a winter trail. In both cases, they're a winter trail. They used, to mark the trail, a tripod. This is our unique Alaska trail marker that, along with the dog team and the dog sled, is perhaps one of our most unique symbols of Alaskan winter trails. And hardly anybody's heard of it. It's a simple design. It's possibly hybridized from native pole structure designs and American Civil War telegraph pole designs. Remember, this is the Alaska Road Commission, and the Army Signal Corps is involved too. And interestingly, I've seen old historic photos of the Civil War and telegraph lines, and they would string the telegraph wires across the battlefields and in areas that had been damaged with similar tripods. So I think this design was found to be a useful design and repeated again. And so the concept that we're still using today out there on the trail is inner visibility, that basically you can see one tripod from the other tripod. And these tripods were appreciated by the people who were out there on the trail and made it so that people could travel the trails and get from one place to another more safely. Here's a diary that's kept by, I'm trying to remember his first name, can't remember it, but Cadwallader. And he talks about how joyfully he felt when he stumbled onto a tripod crossing the Rainy Pass area. So by 1914, one could hire a ride on a dog sled for the 520-mile trail between Iditarod and Seward for $177, which would be about equal to a half year of the average pay for a person. People made about $1 a day back in those days. So probably didn't have a lot of takers. But nonetheless, it was out there. If you had done a good deal of profitable gold mining, you could potentially run back forth and catch a ride to Seward and a boat outside. but more likely people were walking from roadhouse to roadhouse. This is a map of the various roadhouses between Seward and Iditarod in 1914, with the roadhouses in the red and white dot, and then the towns in the call out boxes with the red lettering. Not a lot of towns back in those days, but a fair number of roadhouses out there. Roadhouses may have been staffed more likely in the towns themselves, but pretty much in a lot of cases they were unstaffed too in more remote locations. I would mention that if you go to our partner's website, iditarod100.org, they have a story map on there that we built that follows the travels of a gold miner who walked from Iditarod to Seward and his stays at these various different roadhouses along the way. In a lot of cases, I had mentioned they were self-serve, and that means that hopefully you've brought a fair amount of food, because there usually wasn't a lot of food at these different locations. This is one of these swank roadhouses, French Joe's Roadhouse, which is on the north side of the Alaska Range, back in the period when the trail was under heavy use. And here's a view of the same Pioneer Roadhouse, also known as French Joe's, after the Turquoise Lake fire in 2010. You can see the outlines, which is all that's left of these roadhouse structures that burnt down because of a fire that passed through the area. And because most of these cabins were built with local biodegradable materials, most of them haven't lasted today. They were built with logs, sod, dirt, maybe a little bit of glass, and they really don't survive forest fires, floods, or the constant weight of the heavy snows that bear down on the drying and the rotting wood that's found out there. So after World War I, the Alaska Road Commission took over building what were called relief cabins, and which is what we have today out there on the trail. BLM manages 5 relief cabins. We don't call them relief cabins anymore. We call them public shelter cabins. State of Alaska has a number also, call them safety cabins. But they were hiring crews to get out there and basically establish safety shelters on heavily used routes. Soon after World War I, though, a newfangled invention took the US mail from the age of dogs to the age of air, and that was the airplane. It was first used in 1924 to fly mail from Fairbanks to McGrath. This mail had been taken by train from Seward, and then and to get to Seward had been taken by a steamer from Seattle. But pretty quickly it was determined that a much easier way to get around was to fly over the landscape than it was to go cross country. So important items and people started to travel. On the left, we've got a cutout of the rates between various communities. You've got flat to basically to Fairbanks for $300, which is pretty darn pricey. Also the town of Iditarod, they're some of the most expensive places. So dog teams were still playing a role in regional transportation, but aircraft were starting to make a really bad pun, take off. The airplane, though, wasn't available and useful for certain situations, and one was the dreaded diphtheria outbreak in Nome in the midwinter of 1925. There was an attempt to get diphtheria serum up to Nome in 1925. That was not successful. And so instead, diphtheria serum vaccines were gathered up and shipped up by railroad up to Nenana, which is about 60 miles outside of Fairbanks, and the closest location to Nome, only a 674-mile mush down the Yukon River, up and over the Caltag Portage, and around Norton Sound. And okay, I guess you aren't seeing the arrow unless I put it right there. So in less than 5.5 days, 20 teams of mushers and dogs traveled at 674 miles through temperatures that never really got above -20. And in many cases, the temperatures were -30, -40, and -50. In some cases, the mushers' hands were literally frozen to the dogs, to the sleds themselves. So it was an epic journey, and one that was reported breathlessly by the media in the lower 48, and brought to notoriety and national attention heroes, like I said previously, Leonard Seppala and Togo here, who led his team over the majority of the trail, and then Balto, who has gotten a lot of press and history, but was really only handled the serum on the last 30 miles or so of the trail. And there's been a lot of spin over the years too, which is an interesting thing to examine and see how the media has taken the different stories and amplified certain parts of them and missed other parts of these stories. So again, just part of the fascination of being close. It's not often you see Anchorage referred to as a magic town, but like I mentioned, there's a lot of boosterism that went on in those days. Anchorage basically became the major, you should say, we could say, one of the major causes that the town of Iditarod became a ghost town. All of a sudden, there was a well-paying jobs that were being advertised to build a railroad for the next 5 years out of Anchorage. And so many people moved from Iditarod to the town of Anchorage, along with World War I, which also helped to populate Iditarod itself. So here's a photo of Iditarod in the mid-1920s. Pretty much time has passed it by. The post office was closed in Iditarod in the mid-1920s. And the town lost a lot of its functionality also because the river that it had been situated on, it was actually on an oxbow, and the river bypassed the oxbow. So no longer were you able to reach the river by steamboat. So it was not possible really to reach the town with freight any further. One thing I want to mention to you here, if you take a look at this building right here, this was the Northern Commercial Company, and it pretty much lasted right up until this present day, although crumbling. This is the same building right here, and this is the town of Iditarod in 2007. So time bypassed the town of Iditarod for half a century and covered the old road scars. Birch trees sprouted from the main streets of the town. And the same happened with the old sled dog trail itself too. And that was until the 1960s when some Alaskans began reviving this old tradition of long distance sled dog racing. People like Joe Reddington Sr. wanted to go just beyond the sprint dog racing that was happening in the 1950s and started to get back into long distance racing. And he came up with this idea about a 1,000-mile dog sled race across Alaska. He had originally wanted to race just to the town of Iditarod, but there's literally nothing in Iditarod at the time. So they decided, well, we should just keep going and go to Nome, which is what they did. So this year we're at the 50th anniversary of the running of the Iditarod sled dog race. And the sled dog race was established to bring back the culture of dog mushing, promote healthy competition, and as a way to bring more attention to the historic trail itself. So since that time in the early 1970s, this hardy band of adventurous in Alaska who also like to take care of dogs have been working to move cross country with dog teams from basically South Central Alaska up to Nome itself. From the very beginning of the race and then the conservation of the historic trail, the two have been entwined. For instance, if you take a look here at the logos, it's pretty much the same dog. And this is because a lot of the people who were volunteers for the Iditarod Race Committee were also volunteers and supporters for the National Historic Trail, and worked on both sides to make each other a reality. These mushers pushed for the trail to be protected, and they got Congress to fund a study on the feasibility of protecting and improving the old trails. And as I mentioned, a good trail, even 100 years ago, is a good trail today if things really haven't changed. And so they got Congress to take a look at the feasibility of establishing a new trail around the Iditarod. And at the same time, there was similar studies that were going on around the country that looked at other trails like the Lewis and Clark Trail, the Mormon Pioneer Trail, the California Trail. And so those were all bundled together. And in 1978, the National Trail System Act was amended to include these trails and the Iditarod Trail and designate it as a National Historic Trail. So today we have 19 National Historic Trails and 11 National Scenic Trails, the National Scenic Trails being like the Appalachian Trail, like I mentioned. So this is the Iditarod National Historic Trail System today. Basically, it represents the web of trails and main line that ran from Seward to Nome through the gold fields, and a number of the side trails that went to various different gold rushes over the past century. Things aren't as simple though these days. This is a land ownership, and so because there are so many different land ownerships for the trail itself, there was a requirement to go out and do a plan for the trail. And so a comprehensive management plan was developed and adopted in 1986. But it really encouraged and strongly promoted cooperation and coordination between the different landowners. Basically, because when you're out on a trail, you really can't tell and won't tell when you're on state land or BLM land, this sort of thing. So from the earliest years on in the whole movement of national trails that have since really blossomed across the country to what we have today with rails, trails, and whatnot, cooperation was a really important ethos that I think got a big boost in Alaska, because here in Alaska, we like to think we do things differently. So what do we do for the trail at BLM? We only own about 200 miles of the trail, but as I mentioned, we do things by partnership. When it comes to improvements, trail maintenance, or education, we do things by collaborating with various parties who have the same interests at heart. This presentation tonight, for instance, is a collaboration between two different land managers for the Iditarod National Historic Trail, that's BLM, and the Forest Service, the nonprofit Historic Trail Alliance, and private contractors. In this picture, we've got the private nonprofit Student Conservation Association doing work for BLM out at the Roan public shelter cabin. Also on the Iditarod, I mentioned we're getting near to the season where it becomes a venue for 3 long-distance winter overland competitive events. BLM authorizes permits for these uses out on the trail, and basically the trail gets opened up nowadays for this intervillage and long distance travel for competitive uses. It's kind of interesting that back in the old days, people were going for the gold, and now people maybe are going for a belt buckle or just bragging rights about how well they finished on a long distance fat bike race or that sort of thing. But it brings use out on the trail, and it recreates the use of the trail, which is something that Congress had intended all along. These event participants make use of the trail and BLM's public shelter cabins, including the historic Roan public shelter cabin in this picture, which is the oldest structure on the trail managed by BLM. It was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1938. And it's some of the still standing historic resources that you found out on the trail today. And it's a good time for us to be traveling out on the trail. We're out there on the trail, checking the condition of these various cabins, figuring out what sort of maintenance needs to occur, watching the changes in the climate, unfortunately. That's rain on the windshield, well, that's snowmobile, and that's open water on Norton Sound. And this is a competitor in the Iditarod Trail Invitational. And this gentleman had walked starting in Knik, and he was up past Unaclete, and he spent 30 days walking to Nome. So it provides a venue for people to get out there and test their mettle, just as people had 100 years ago. As I mentioned, we get out there and we do checks on the cabins that BLM owns, so we know what sort of work we need to do with them on the summertime, such as foundation work on the Old Woman Public Shelter cabin here. In 2009 and 10, we worked with a number of different partners and built or refurbished 8 different shelter cabins along the trail, and plugged some really long distance holes, primarily between the Yukon and the Kuskokwim rivers, where basically you get out into the countryside there and you'll find that there is no place to get out of the weather. For hundreds and hundreds of miles, there is nothing but little Charlie Brown Christmas trees. So it's a pretty foreboding landscape out there, with not a lot of country to hide in, especially when the wind is blowing and it's 20 below out. As I mentioned, we work with local partners, and here we've got some modern tripods going in with Old Woman Mountain in the background. We adapted the design that they used 100 years ago and ended up using landscape timbers that you can buy at Home Depot because they come in packs of pallets of 250 or so. And you need an awful lot of these things when you're putting them out every 300 feet or so. We've also been working on a waymarking signing program. As I mentioned, hundreds of miles of Charlie Brown Christmas trees all look alike out there, and it's pretty darn easy to not know where you're at on the trail itself. And agencies have been helping out, like the State Division of Forestry and BLM's Alaska Fire Service, protecting some of the few historic structures that are still standing out there on the trail. The interior of Alaska is a fire regime country. Fires burn throughout the countryside there frequently, and I showed photos before of the Pioneer Roadhouse being burnt up. This is another shelter cabin known as Don's, which is a more recent name. But this cabin would have been burnt down if the State Division of Forestry hadn't done a bunch of defense around the cabin system, which had been restored by the state of Alaska, and with a new roof and new walls and new entryway. And because of their setting out sprinklers and doing defense in the area, the fire, which had been burning up the mountain out of the picture, came down and basically just went around it, and it survives to this day. BLM is also involved in educational efforts with partners such as this presentation, and on years when we don't have COVID, the Science Center is often open during the Iditarod ceremonial start, which this year we're really not throwing the doors wide open to the public because we want to keep all the mushers healthy as they travel up through the villages to Nome. So that pretty much wraps up my presentation here. I've just got a couple different web links. As I mentioned before, Iditarod100.org is a good one to take a look at. BLM's Iditarod National Historic Trail website has a really good map on it that you can take a look at that shows both the historic and the contemporary trail out there, and where the shelter cabins are. And I would encourage also taking a look at the Iditarod sled dog race, which is Iditarod100.com. If you are a teacher and have a bunch of students involved, or just for yourself, they have different ways that you can enroll and follow GPSs that are broadcasting off their sleds and follow real-time progress. ITI Alaska, which is the Iditarod Trail Invitational, are the people who are fat tire biking and basically running across Alaska. And the photography is superb. When you're on the back of a dog sled or a snowmobile, you don't have a lot of time to take pictures, but these folks do, and they really have captured the beauty and the nature of the countryside that folks are crossing there. So I definitely recommend taking a look at those websites. So I'm going to stop right now and have a chance to take questions.
Kevin, that was just fascinating. Thank you so much. As always,
You bet.
I feel like I learn something new every time I hear you talk. It's really fun. Thanks a lot. And I invite anybody who's got a question, you can type them right into the chat. Um, and while you do, I'll take a minute to, oh, I see, we've got a question already. Do people who live in villages along the trail depend on it as a winter transportation route?
Yes, totally. Basically, the only way to get between villages is by, as we call them in Alaska, snow machines, and that
Mhm.
makes ice for your drink. We call snowmobiles snow machines up here. I don't know. Or fly. And so it's really unique when you go out to these villages and you come to a little village and none of the streets are plowed or anything like that. There's snow covered. And people basically get around by walking or by snowmobile. So it's a critical piece of equipment, and villages mark the different routes and have search and rescue groups that work on them. And the Iditarod Alliance, which is our partner, is actually working with the village of White Mountain on building a new safety cabin between White Mountain and Nome, because the old one was sited in a location that just didn't work out. Basically, it turns into a glacier during the wintertime. So yes, they do.
Hmm. I had a question too, actually. I was wondering, how
You.
could something called a national archive burn? That's like, isn't that like exactly the whole point of having a national archive, is that it doesn't burn? Is that really what happened?
I think it was in one location. Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
This was back in the 70s, something like that.
Mm,
Or,
yeah, people were a little, yeah.
right. A long time ago. Because, and the other thing was, and we've run into this also in Alaska, a lot of our historic documents have basically been moved to Seattle. And I thought I had heard the fire was in St. Louis or something like that. So,
Hmm.
some of these agencies generate these, this is the Army Signal Corps or something like that, and their records go off to who knows where, and then they get shipped off in a box to, et cetera, et cetera. And
Mhm.
so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, let's see if anybody else has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll just take a minute to say that if you'd like to know about future sessions of this webinar, just write to iTrekAlaska@gmail.com, and someone will send you a link. I want to talk some about the upcoming sessions, but I see we already have another question in chat. Can you tell us more about how climate change is affecting the trail and how you think it will affect the trail in the future?
That's a very good question. It has significantly affected the trail already. I feel like we've lost between a half a month and a month of winter on the trail up here because the snows don't come as early as they used to come, and the snow melts off earlier than it used to melt off.
Hmm.
So we're losing weeks on both ends. Then we have some really unique, but these weren't unheard of historically, and you can read about them in the documentation. Events where you have rain on snow events, some major warm-ups. A buddy of mine describes global climate change as global or climate weirding. And
Mm.
so we have these weird, 100-year storms that occur or repeatedly. So the ability to travel over the trail is challenged. It becomes more dangerous to travel the trail. I didn't mention, for instance, the town of Bethel, which is on the lower Kuskokwim River, they plow like a 200-mile ice road every year. between them and the lower communities. But because the seasons are shortened, people's vehicles are falling in the ice, people are falling in the ice on their snowmobiles. So it's life-threatening. The other thing too is that, I mean, it's kind of a mind shift when you think about it. People rely on the ice to freeze and provide this solid travel surface. And when you don't have that solid travel surface, all of a sudden things are very different. So sled dog races now are having to be relocated on shore as compared to have been using these long distance river systems. So there's a lot of different ways that climate change is affecting the trail. And it's just making travel on the trail more challenging, basically. That's a great question.
Yeah, and I'm sure life along the trail as well.
Yeah.
Great. I invite other questions if anybody has any. And while you're thinking about those, I'll just let you know some upcoming sessions. On February 1st, we're going to have a webinar about reflection and how you can use reflection as part of your teaching of place-based learning with Marshall Welch. He's coming up he'll be joining us virtually from California, and he's presented to the INHT group a number of times, really very well received by teachers. On February 17th, we'll be doing the last of the 3 questing sessions, learning a bunch more about map making, research, and clue writing. On March 1st, we'll have a presentation on the iTrek Educator Resource Guide, which is something you can get a copy of and helps you to think all about all the ways you can use iTrek as a focal point in your teaching. On March 24th, we'll have outdoor classrooms focused on Wolverine Park, and then March 31st is nature art, and then there are a bunch more in April. So I won't keep going, but we've got a lot more coming up, and we would love to see you here for these. And if you'd like more information, itrekalaska@gmail.com. I don't see any other questions in chat. Does anybody have one though? I don't want to cut it off. We've got Kevin. We want to hold on to him. Okay. I'm thinking that maybe we are done. Kevin, that was just a fantastic presentation. So fascinating. Thanks a lot. You're a wealth of knowledge, and you're getting
Well, thank you, Dila.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. Great to see you.
You're getting some.
Yeah, good to see you too. Huh?
Well.
Yeah. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay. Good night.
Yeah. Yep.